Thank you, Lionel, for that very kind introduction and for the invitation to speak. When someone always says that your comments are interesting, it's always hard to know exactly what is meant by that. But I will take it, I think, in the spirit in which it's delivered. So thank you very much for coming, and I look forward to talking with you about this paper, and then welcome your comments and your questions, either afterward or by email if there are things that occur to you later. So in 1961, the Italian artist Piero Manzoni embarked on a very curious project. Manzoni provided various associates, including the art gallery owner Mario Dicono and the artist Marcel Brutaya, with certificates of authenticity. And each certificate was signed and numbered and watermarked, and it attested that the holder of the certificate was to be considered as an authentic work of art. For all intents and purposes as of the date of the certificate. So of course Manzoni's project was, as it was no doubt intended to do, raise questions on a couple of levels. One, it was yet another iteration of the familiar query, what is art? So can something become a work of art simply because the artist declares it to be so? Does it become a work of art by the affixation of a signature? Or a name? Is the claiming of something as a work of art is what makes it art? Or is there some sort of characteristic that we would say qualifies something as a work of art? So if we look at something like this, right, which you see on your supermarket shelf, would be simply an item of commerce, a label, a way of telling you which sort of tomato soup you wish to buy. Of course, if you see this framed on the walls of the Museum of Modern Art, all of a sudden it becomes something very different. And the reason why it is different is because this one has Andy Warhol's name affixed to it, and the label on the can in the supermarket does not. The project, Manzoni's project also raised a related question, which is who gets to decide what is art? And more broadly, what purpose does a statement of, here we'll introduce the term authenticity, serve in any particular context? So what does it mean? We see the word sort of used all the time for something to be real or authentic. And by contrast, what does it mean when we say something is inauthentic or not genuine or fake? And is that different from saying something is a copy or a reproduction? And if so, how? And so I think all of this is sort of bound up in these sort of interesting questions that are raised in Manzoni's work. And so it should come as no surprise that what's displayed in Boston's Museum of Fine Art in Boston, Massachusetts, of course, is not Mario Diacono or Marcel Brutaya, but the certificate itself, which purports to authenticate something as a work of art, but in fact turns out to be the art itself. And so in this regard, this sort of self-referential nature of authenticity, Manzoni's works joins other works, Robert Rauschenberg's 1961 work, This is a Portrait of Iris Clert, If I Say So, which, as you can see, consists of the words, this is a portrait of Iris Clert, if I say so, typed in a telegram sent from Stockholm to Ms. Clert in Paris. Marcel Duchamp, of course, did this most famously with his 1917 work, Fountain, which is simply a urinal, signed and tipped on its side, which ultimately, as Thierry Duvet noted, reduces the artwork to the statement, naming it as such. And Robert Morris created this work, which was called Litanies, sold it to architect Philip Johnson. Philip Johnson was late in paying for it. And so what Robert Morris did instead was he submitted the document on the left and the outline of the previous work on the right. And the document says, the undersigned Robert Morris, he was obviously annoyed that he hadn't gotten his payment. The undersigned Robert Morris, being the maker of the metal construction entitled Litanies, which of course was this, being the maker of the metal construction entitled Litanies described in the annexed Exhibit A, hereby withdraws from said construction all aesthetic quality and content, and declares from the date hereof that said construction has no such quality or content. And Johnson, he who had not paid for the original work of art, purchased the document. right? And so the deed was done. And now both the original sculpture and this now document now hang in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. So these works, I think, highlight for us the way in which statements of authenticity, both for creative work and, as we'll talk about, for trademarked goods, these statements do not stand on their own. They require us to decide what something is when it is authentic, what it means to be authentic, whether and when we care about authenticity, and what sort of information that we need in order to make that determination. So, what does it mean for something or someone to be authentic? So in one sense, it's, as Walter Benjamin has noted, a way of connecting something to a particular time or place. So when an art expert states that a painting is an authentic Rembrandt, she is saying something about the coexistence of that work and the artist in time or space, right? They're saying that Rembrandt, we'll speak about that in a minute, but Rembrandt was involved in the work's creation, that the work was made in the Netherlands in 1630, not in China in 2012, right? Similarly, when we have geographic indicators, right? Those tell us that it's authenticity relating to provenance in the form of terroir, right? So champagne, properly applied, according to the French, right, tells us that the beverage comes from the Champagne region of France, and that therefore is authentic champagne, as opposed to coming from, say, Northern California or Italy. And so that connection, again, to draw from Walter Benjamin, is about the aura of the object. It is something special or different that makes it attractive to us. And so we believe that a copy or a reproduction does not have whatever that is. So that aura could be, for example, an aura of exclusivity, right? So the idea being that there is one Mona Lisa or a limited supply of Birkin handbags, and that's what makes them authentic, is the idea that they are in short supply and only a select few have access to them. Or it could be an aura of distinctiveness, right? So the idea, and this is sort of consonant with the sense of a trademark, right? The idea that we're saying that the Mona Lisa is authentic because it involves a certain sense of quality or a certain sense of technical skill. Perhaps it's the aura of inventiveness. So it's the idea that authenticity, we prize authenticity for things that seem to us to be sort of different or creative or appealing in some particular way, as opposed to things that are sort of run-of-the-mill. We don't much care about authentic hammers, for example, or authentic hairbrushes, but we care very much about authentic designer bags or authentic paintings. So authenticity in some sense then represents a set of characteristics or qualities that we've determined are relevant. And so if somebody had the technical skill to paint an exact copy of the Mona Lisa, brush stroke for brush stroke, so that an expert couldn't tell the difference, we would still say, or at least many of us would say, that one is authentic and one is not, even though they would have precisely the same aesthetic appeal. In another sense, and again relating to the sense of what we mean by sort of source in trademark law, authentic would mean something that comports with a particular standard or a Platonic ideal, even if we don't actually tie it to a particular time frame or a particular geography or a particular source or a particular manufacturer. So when we say an authentic Italian sauce, right, for pasta sauce, they're not claiming that the tomatoes have been shipped over from Rome, right? They're not claiming that anyone who is Italian has actually participated in the making of the sauce. What they're saying is that the sort of characteristics of the sauce are consistent with what we might expect from an Italian pasta sauce, right? Or we describe a folk singer, right, as authentic, right? If they have a certain set of qualities or expectations about their music, even if they happen to be born in a part of the country, as Bob Dylan was, that's not typically associated with the type of music that they perform. We use the word authentic to talk about our political candidates. This is hearkening a few years back, right? But the gentleman on the left was believed to be very authentic, right? Because of engaging in clearing brush and in similar activities. The gentleman on the right, John Kerry, right, engaged in highfalutin activities such as windsurfing and the like, right? It was deemed to be sort of inauthentic. Now, of course, when we use authentic to describe all of these things, we're already admitting of some level of falsity in that description, right? So as long as we perceive the spaghetti sauce or the folk singer or the politician as authentic, we don't actually seem to care too much about the actual provenance of any of those things. So the authentic Italian sauce is actually made in Canada. Right? The folk singer actually grew up in Minnesota. Right? Changed his name from Robert Zimmerman to Bob Dylan. Right? The authentic politician on the left came to clearing brush relatively late in life, after a series of private schools and Ivy League universities. Right? So, like a trademark, authenticity signals to us that this thing, this person, this artwork, this song, this pasta sauce, whatever it is, will meet our expectations, so long as that expectation is not actual source. Right? That sort of true connection to actual source. And this, of course, is just the nature of modern production. So at one point, a trademark did tell you directly who made or produced the thing that you were holding, that piece of pottery, had that mark on the bottom, and that told you the name of the artisan who created the pot. But of course now we have outsourcing, we have licensing, the products are produced overseas, we have product diversification, and so sometimes all we can say is that what the trademark signifies is some sort of approval of the final product. So the Nike trademark, for example, tells us that the running shoe has a particular appearance or a particular fit, but it no longer signifies that the running shoe, the trainer, was made in Oregon, right, which is sort of the original connotation of Nike, because Nike now outsources its production to Indonesia, I believe. So as brands become less about this actual provenance and more about our emotional experience with the brand and this idea that the mark is telling us, you can trust me, right? It's that last sort of, we've signed off on this, we approve on this. So the meaning of authenticity then follows suit. So now when Coke tells us, or told us at one time, that it was the real thing, it means basically Coke, not as compared to Pepsi, but Coke is real compared to a life without Coke in it. Now, as many of you are well aware, I mentioned Rembrandt before. We could say very much the same thing about, of course, most art, or a lot of art. I shouldn't say most, I suppose, but Rembrandt is a particular example of this. So like many artists of his era, Rembrandt did not paint every inch of his paintings himself. He worked in a studio system, and he had a number of assistants who would use to fill in the background or sketch a foot or apply the final brush strokes. And so an artist was more precisely an artisan. It was somebody who produced the work very skillfully according to a particular technique, but often was working in response to particular directives from a patron, and assembling a team of assistants who were actually responsible for doing the physical work. And in that circumstance, there was nothing inauthentic about that system, and no one would say that it wasn't an authentic Rembrandt simply because someone else touched most of the rest of the painting. In fact, one commentator has noted that the purchaser was under no illusion in this era as to the nature of the painting. He did not demand that the artist, and I'm quoting here, should carry out every operation with his own hand, from the priming of the canvas to the final date and signature. The signature, here again is a quote, was not the hallmark of genius. It was the trademark of the studio. So authenticity refers more than to sort of the subject matter than to the artist itself. The portrait is authentic, not because it was accomplished by a particular artist, but because it meets a certain set of qualities and characteristics, much like the pasta sauce, right? Now that changed in the Romantic era, right? We had the emergence of sort of the author as a persona, that's modern focus on personality, and so our sense of authenticity changed, so we focus much more on the artist as having this tie to authenticity, as opposed to the art, right? We value the painting not simply for the aesthetics, but because of the image, the persona of the artist. And yet, right, even though the sort of image of the Romantic author toiling away in the garret to produce works of genius, this vision seems to be at the center, certainly, of US copyright law in certain respects. Modern art reacquaints us with this Rembrandt idea of the studio. So we have Andy Warhol's Factory, right? It's very much the same system. Or Dale Chihuly, I don't know if anyone is familiar with his work. Dale Chihuly is a glass sculptor. He does a lot of chandeliers and things like that, and glass sculptures along these lines. He, because of an earlier incident, as you will see, he's missing his sight in one eye. He also has a shoulder injury. He can no longer actually blow any of the glass himself. So he has an entire studio of assistants who do all the work for him, according to what are sometimes some very rudimentary sketches. And yet at the end of the day, the work is a Chihuly, right? It sells for thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars, because it has his name on it, even though he has very little interaction, physical interaction, with the finished pieces, except for this idea of signing off, or this approval, this sense of trust as a communication between the artist and the purchaser. And this is, and critics have accepted this, of course. Of Warhol, Richard Dormant once said, his primary role in the creation of his later works was simply that he signed them when they were sold. And he had come to realize, the artist had come to realize, a painting could be an original Andy Warhol, even if he had never touched it. So authenticity now, in many instances, is equated with authorization. Right? And we use that as our guarantee of quality or of characteristics, whether we're talking about a piece of art or whether we're talking about trainers. And it's actually reflected as well, to some extent, in the Vice Chancellor's 1990 opinion in Mirage Studios, which we'll return to a bit later. And I thank Lionel for directing me to that, where the Vice Chancellor states that the public expects, when they see a copyrighted character on merchandise, such as a T-shirt, for example, they expect that that appearance is due to licensing from the copyright holder, that conveys authorization or approval, right? So this, because we conceive now this idea of authenticity as largely involving the question of authority, this is how we can conceive of something as being an authentic reproduction, right? Which is a term we hear from time to time, because it replicates certain qualities of the original and is approved, right, by the creator, but it doesn't claim any sort of situation in time or place. Right? And it's how we can use this concept of authenticity both with a painting, right, in which we typically would think authentic means there is only one, but we have the Warhol screen print, right, in which the distinction between original and copy becomes much more complicated. And then, of course, on the other end, the trainer, in which there's no linkage at all between what makes something authentic and the idea of scarcity. The idea of authenticity as equating to authorization or authority comes to a head, I think, in the concept of the true fake. I don't know if that's a concept that anyone has encountered before. So a true fake is what happens when you have a factory, let's say they're making a Prada handbag. The Prada has arranged for or authorized the production line to produce X number of copies during the day. At the end of the day, unauthorized, the production line runs off a few more copies of the bag using the same materials, the same workmanship, identical, and then can sell those, right, on the black market, right, unofficially for much cheaper. They are authentic in every way, except for the fact that Prada has not authorized them, right, and therefore they are counterfeit. Right? Except they are identical in workmanship, in the appearance of the bag, in the appearance of the mark on the bag. The only thing that makes them fake is the fact that they are unauthorized. Right? And contrast this, of course, with the concept of authenticity in the fine arts. So if Leonardo or Rembrandt had authorized a friend to churn out 50 copies, right, of the Mona Lisa, right, for sale in local shops, we would consider those to be inauthentic, right? The idea that simply because an artist authorize someone else to make copies wouldn't necessarily confer the idea of authenticity on those, and yet the same practice today engenders much less consternation. Yet, even with modern work, we find some disputes as to how we should interpret this idea of authenticity, right? So I want to introduce another example. Oh, so yes, here's our Mirage, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. We'll come back to that in a little bit. So this is a portrait, a Warhol portrait called Bruno B. Red. And there was, as you may know, a body called the Andy Warhol Authentication Board, which would determine whether or not a Warhol was a genuine Warhol or not. The Andy Warhol Authentication Board concluded that this self-portrait was not, in fact, an authentic Warhol, even though he had signed it, he had dated it, and he had dedicated it, as you can see here on the back. Because although he gave directions to the printer over the phone, the board said he was not present when it was created. And for them, that's what was the difference between the work being authentic and inauthentic. And so even though he gave all the directions as to how this should be done, his physical presence, the lack thereof, made this an inauthentic work. All right. So let's turn now to a consideration of sort of how this gets expressed. And I apologize here for a sort of U.S. focus in the case law. But this question of sort of then, how does the law respond to these questions of authenticity, and the idea that authenticity often depends on what is important to us in valuing the work and what sort of things that we want to take into account in determining whether or not something is authentic or not. So this U.S. Supreme Court, urinal again, has talked about as a general rule, right, the idea is that an author is the party who actually creates the work. That is, the person who translates an idea into a fixed, tangible expression entitled to copyright protection. But of course, we know that this is not true on its face. So in the US, the work made for hire doctrine, where the corporation owns the copyright to the work that its workers produce, right, is an immediate challenge to this concept, the idea that an author doesn't have to be the person who actually puts pen to paper. And of course, there are many situations where the courts are mindful of the collaborative production of a lot of work, where authorship would not necessarily be assigned to the parties that do the work. So for example, a designer who is creating a map and hires somebody to do the last bit of printmaking because they don't have the technical skill, a documentary filmmaker who has to hire photographers to assist with the photography but give specific camera angles and shooting sequences. In all of those cases, the courts say that the person who is the author for purposes of copyright are not the people actually doing the work, but the person who comes up with the idea, the conception, right, as opposed to the actual person running the camera or the map maker actually making the print, which is contrary, of course, to what we talk about here in U.S. copyright law, is the idea of the author being the person who does the fixation, right, who actually puts the expression down on paper or on film. Comparatively, in a very Warhol sense, these cases would recognize that the idea, the concept, what makes it art and who comes up with that idea is the person who is the authentic author. And we can, of course, we can see this in many other instances, right? Any sort of piece of architecture, any sort of great sculpture involving heavy stone, for example, obviously is the result of a collaborative effort. And we have no problem with saying, in fact, that we attribute those to a particular author. We had a particular missed opportunity here. So here's the example of a Chihuly chandelier sculpture. So here's a case involving Chihuly and his former assistant named Brian Rubino. So Rubino actually left Chihuly's workshop and started making his own glass sculpture. And Chihuly brought suit against Rubino, copyright infringement suit, saying that Rubino's glass sculptures infringed Chihuly's. And that's when something happens that probably Chihuly didn't anticipate. I don't know why. He should have, but he did not anticipate that Rubino filed a counterclaim against Chihuly, saying that, in fact, he was the creator of Chihuly's work. Right? And so, therefore, Rubino could not have been infringing Trulli's work. All he was doing was reproducing his own, Rubino's own designs. And the document that helped him in that regard is this one, which is the document from Trulli directing Rubino's how to make the sculpture, which says, as you can see, here's a little sketch, but make whatever you want. We'll get everything up to Tacoma when you're done, and I'll try to come down while you're blowing the glass, right? So this document then entered into evidence, and not surprisingly, the case settled very soon thereafter. And so Rubino making the claim that, in fact, he was not a co-author, probably the sole author of a lot of works that were, in fact, sold to the public as Chihuly's, including the very works that Chihuly had alleged Rubino had infringed. So I want to talk a little bit then about sort of trademark law, right? So we talk about, again, under copyright law, this idea of authorship not being, even though U.S. copyright law suggests that authorship is related to who actually fixes the work or puts it down on paper. But it was really more about often who sort of conceptualized, who comes up with the creative nugget underlying the work, and then therefore it relates not to the author's statements, but to how we engage with or relate to that work. So authenticity sometimes has meaning to us because it tells us something about the nature of the expression who applied the paint to canvas. So sometimes it's authentic because of the technical skill involved. But in other instances, authenticity means to us the nature of the idea, right? Who stands behind whatever it is that we are engaging with. And so trademark law sometimes is not as attentive to that idea. And in particular, there's a U.S. case called Daystar, which addresses this issue. So Daystar involved a book by Dwight Eisenhower called Crusades in Europe. There was a television series based on the book that 20th Century Fox had originally owned the copyright to. It failed to comply with certain formalities, and so it lost the copyright. The footage then ended up in the public domain, and Daystar came along, took that footage, sort of repackaged it, reassembled it, and then put it out as a Daystar production and didn't give any credit to Fox. And so Fox couldn't bring a copyright infringement suit. It had lost the copyright by not complying with the formalities. So it tried to claim that this was essentially a reverse passing off case, that Daystar was taking what was essentially Fox's production, had repackaged it just a little bit, said this is now a Daystar film, and we were releasing it under our own name, and Fox was saying that's not true. You are misleading consumers as to who was responsible for this underlying production. It was us, not you. The Supreme Court rejected this argument as essentially a way to do an end run around the limited term of copyright. But on the way to rejecting it, it said something very interesting, and this is how we'll get back to Mirage as well. So what the court said, Justice Scalia writing for the court, said that the Lanham Act, the U.S. Trademark Act, prohibits actions that deceive consumers, that impair goodwill. It forbids, Coca-Cola passing off its product as Pepsi or reverse passing off Pepsi as its product. But consumers don't care, the justice said, about the origin of the drink in the sense of who came up with the formula. The consumer who buys a branded product does not assume, said the justice, that the brand company came up with this idea, designed it, and they don't care who it was. The words of the Lanham Act should not be stretched to cover matters that are typically of no consequence to purchasers. Right? Now contrast that, of course, with the language from Mirage, right, where the court says the evidence shows the public is aware that the turtle characters, remember this was the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles or the Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles, appearing on a shirt, whether or not consumers would both assume and care about whether that was authorized or not. And the Vice Chancellor says, in general, the public expects to buy what they think they're getting, the genuine article, and so they very much care about the provenance of that artistic work. Now, of course, the court in Daystar acknowledged to some extent that maybe there was a different answer with respect to community of goods. When I buy the New York Times, I don't use the New York Times trademark to tell me something about the quality of the newsprint, right? I'm not buying the New York Times because I love the way the paper feels in my hand, right? I'm buying the New York Times because it tells me something about the content inside the paper, right? So we do care about sort of that authenticity as telling us something about who was the originator or who's the source of that communicative idea. And that's why we value the Warhol or the Chihuly, even if we know that they're not responsible for the physical work behind it. And so Robert Storr, the dean of the Yale School of Art, talks about this directly when he says that's what makes art valuable, right? It's not so much about the person who makes it. Any trained technician can carry out a particular set of instructions. It's about intention and realization. In fact, a New York City painter named Alexander Golitsky noted in a Wall Street Journal article, his paintings are actually at the Victoria and Albert, I believe, and sell for tens of thousands of dollars. Here's an example. All of his work is done by 7 artists in Jaipur. All right? He does not actually do this work himself. In fact, he said to the Wall Street Journal, I prefer not actually to be involved in the painting. And he said, in fact, it would take him 20 years to be as good as his chief painter in India. Right? So, and yet, he is listed as the artist, as the sort of author of these paintings. I haven't been to Victoria and Albert, but I assume that when these are displayed, that he is listed as the artist. They are sold for tens of thousands of dollars because of his name on the work. We see this all the time in literature as to whether or not these sorts of things matter, this connection, this authenticity, and it kind of comes out in curious ways. So the consumers of these paintings apparently don't care very much about the connection between who actually does the work, right, and who the author is. He's the one who conceptualizes the piece, who organizes the piece. But we see other instances in which it seems to matter very much. This is the 1976 book, The Education of Little Tree. It was marketed as the memoir of a Cherokee youth. It received wide acclaim for its very touching portrayal of growing up as a young Native American. It was eventually revealed that its author, Forrest Carter, was in fact Asa Carter. Asa Carter was a white segregationist, Confederate of George Wallace. He said, no doubt accurately, he wanted to write this story, but he realized he couldn't do it under his own name. I'm sure that is entirely accurate. And so he adopted another persona in order to write the story. And of course, once it was revealed who he was, the same story, the same novel that had been included on the syllabus of Native American literature courses and hailed as this remarkably true-to-life, touching memoir was now, reviled as a fraud, right? Even though the words of the text had not changed one bit, right? We see it more recently, a book, Million Little Pieces. It was marketed as the author's memoir of his journey through drug abuse. He was exposed by Oprah Winfrey on her show, made this actually the subject of a class action lawsuit. Resulting in a settlement obligating him and his publisher to refund the money of anybody who wanted to get their refund. Only about 1,700 people asked to be reimbursed. The Imitation of Vermeer by the famous forger Han van Meegeren. He said one day his paintings were worth millions of guilders. Experts and art lovers came from all over the world, paid money to see it. As soon as he was revealed as the artist, his paintings were worth nothing. And he said nobody would cross the street to see them for free. And so this question of sort of what it means to be authentic changes our valuation and our value of each of these works, even though the work itself has not changed, right? So we can appreciate the story, the memoir, the aesthetics of the painting exactly the same way before or after. But our sense of that connection of authenticity is what gives that work value. But of course, there are lots of other instances in which we don't care about authenticity in that sense. We seek out the fake, right? We buy handbags on the streets from stalls for $10 or our Rolex watches. We know what we're getting. It doesn't matter to us. We hang in our dormitory rooms posters, reproductions of Van Gogh, right? It doesn't matter to us. There's a city in China that is their chief export, is churning out, right, these imitations of Van Goghs for people to hang on their walls. We understand that politicians do not write their own speeches. In fact, they often copy other people's speeches, right? As Joe Biden eventually had to credit Neil Kinnock. that we understand that. We still refer to that as a very powerful speech by the president, even though we didn't write it. He didn't write it. The congressional record, which is supposed to be the sort of transcript of what goes on the floor of the U.S. Congress, is in fact, even though it is the official report, as it turns out, every member is allowed to revise his or her remarks after he's made them as part of the official record. And so often the congressional record has no more than the faintest resemblance to what was actually said on the floor of Congress. In fact, the Library of Congress, in describing the congressional record on its website, says that the congressional record is actually more accurate than the televised proceedings because the members can grammatically revise, provide grammatical revisions and extend their remarks, and you cannot do that during a live broadcast of the proceedings. And so the Library of Congress says this is a more accurate representation of what was said. So let me just sort of wrap up here, then we can turn to questions. There are lots of instances in which, just to extend this a bit, where we have duplications or forgeries that gain value from the fact of what we would say is inauthenticity. Michelangelo, of course, engaged in a number of forgeries himself of Roman sculptures. If we still had those today, of course, would be very highly prized. It was said in the 19th century that Jean-Baptiste Camille knowingly signed works that were made by other people, right? And that's what gave them value. One commentator said it's a long-standing French joke that of the 2,500 paintings he produced in his lifetime, 8,000 of them can be found in America. We know that Photoshop, right? We prefer the photoshopped or retouched photos of celebrities and others to the originals. Now, so of course, we constantly decry this idea of the inauthentic, the Disney World or the Venetian Hotel in Las Vegas, Colonial Williamsburg, where my school is located. Walter Benjamin, of course, would say that this disrupts the aura of the original and it extracts sameness from what is unique. Architecture critic Ada Huxtable would say that authentic reproduction is the con word of American culture because a copy is still a copy and it doesn't matter how skillful you do it, right? But we collectively, as I've mentioned, decide what we want to value as authentic or not authentic and what sort of things make something authentic or not authentic. Daniel Boorstin has said, what is more natural in a democratic age? That we should begin to measure the stature of a work of art by how widely and how well it is reproduced. So, what I want to say sort of in conclusion, right, is this idea that the stories that we have, the dialogues that we have amongst ourselves and with creators as to what something means to be authentic, what it means to be a source, what sorts of licensing and outsourcing and assistance we're willing to accept and still value something as true and as authentic is part of the dialogue of artistic and cultural and consumer engagement. And so, for example, we have Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, the recreation of her pearl necklace, her fake pearls, right? So let me start, actually, so these were not real pearls, these were fake costume jewelry, right? Her fake pearls sold for $200,000 at an auction. The buyer then used them to create reproductions for sale to consumers that she sold for $200 a strand. She sold about 130,000 copies. And so she had what she called the one true copy of Jackie Kennedy's real fake pearls, right, which she then used to create further reproductions. We have examples of what this website experiment called Significant Objects, which auctioned on eBay these various mundane items you might find in any shop, but they had fiction writers created fake narratives to go along with them to describe their history and provenance. So then these items were suddenly worth about hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars because people wanted this ridiculous object you could have gotten in any jumble shop but now had an interesting story attached to it, and that made it worth more. So it's all, I think, about in what instance we are willing to value this question of authenticity. And so one way it comes up most directly in trademark law is this idea of whether or not, for example, and getting back to the Mirage case, right, whether we have what we might say is the authentic William and Mary cap, right, on the left, the inauthentic cap on the right, because it has been not authorized to be produced. why don't we let the consumer decide whether or not they value that statement of authenticity, right? So if each cap manufacturer can say to the consumer, this one has been approved by the college, this one has not, and the consumers who value that statement of authenticity can pay more for the cap that is authorized and less for the cap that is not. Same too, you can have your two arsenal shops set up next to one another. One is selling official arsenal gear, one is selling unofficial, unauthorized arsenal gear. And to the extent that the consumers understand exactly what they're getting, they can pay for that statement of authenticity, right? So we care about authenticity when we're invested in it, we put our trust in it, we feel as if we were deceived. We care if, for example, we have a policy about supporting certain artists or not supporting certain artists. We want to find out whether that artist had something to do with the painting or the company had something to do with the brand. But I think that we need to have a good sense, or at least a better sense in intellectual property law, of how to reconcile these conceptions about authorship, about attribution, about conveying information to consumers and allowing individuals and consumers to make the decisions that they want to make, free from, I think, the law's, what I would say is often an overreach in telling them what they're allowed to engage with and what they're not. So let me close, I'll skip ahead here for a minute, with this counterpart. This is a 2005 work by artist Carrie Young. It's a counterpart to the Manzoni that we started with. It is an ink on paper rendering in the style of an organ donor card. And her work gives the recipient, as you can see, the final word as to whether or not the card constitutes a work of art, right? In a mode of sort of offer and acceptance. In consideration of the donation of this card to me by the artist, I hereby agree that this object will only become an artwork by her upon the inclusion of my signature, right? And that it will retain its status as an artwork solely for the duration of the artist's life or my life, whichever is the shorter. So I think this work actually makes very clear what Manzoni's work suggested, which is that the idea of authenticity is not simply about just a statement from the author, but it's about a dialogue between the author, the creator, the manufacturer, and the consumer. So I'll close with that. Thank you very much. And I welcome any sort of questions or suggestions or dialogue you would like to have.